Greetings, dear viewers. In this segment, I want to tell you about Gyrocars. This technology is extremely interesting, as it is not quite a car, but also not exactly a motorcycle. The key feature is the way these vehicles are kept upright, namely by using a gyroscope. Yes, monocoques or cycle cars, whichever you prefer, may look quite similar at first glance, but the main difference is precisely the presence or absence of a gyroscope in monocoques. Let's leave that for a separate story and move on to reviewing gyroscopically stabilized single-track vehicles. Make yourself comfortable and enjoy watching. Back in 1852, Jean-Bernard Léon Foucault, a French physicist, mathematician, and astronomer, presented a device called the Gyroscope at the Paris Academy of Sciences. The report was devoted to methods of experimentally detecting the Earth's rotation in inertial space. This is what gave the gyroscope its name. A gyroscope is a device capable of responding to changes in the angular orientation of the body on which it is mounted, relative to an inertial reference frame. A spinning top is the simplest gyroscope. When its flywheel rotates in one plane and we try to move it perpendicularly, it demonstrates gyroscopic properties. The gyroscope will resist the force, restoring the original position of the axis of rotation. As Wikipedia says, a Gyrocars is a two-wheeled automobile. The difference between a bicycle or motorcycle and a gyrocar is that in a bicycle, dynamic balance is maintained by the rider and in some cases by the geometry and mass distribution of the bicycle itself, as well as the gyroscopic effects of the wheels. A motorcycle is controlled by the precession of the front wheel, while in a gyrocar, balance is maintained by one or more gyroscopes. The pioneer of gyro-stabilized vehicles is rightfully considered to be Louis Brennan, an Irishman by origin who moved to Australia with his parents at a young age. Apparently, Louis had good aptitude for engineering. He began his career as a watchmaker and later served as a sergeant in the Victorian Engineering Service. In 1874, he came up with the idea of creating a guided torpedo, and 3 years later, in 1877, he patented his torpedo design. Brennan went to England in 1880 and presented his invention to the War Office, and eventually the patent was purchased for a sum of about £100,000 sterling. In 1887, Brennan was appointed head of the Brennan Torpedo Factory and worked as a consulting engineer from 1896 to 1907. During this period, Louis became interested in gyroscopes. He worked extensively with a monorail locomotive that was kept upright by the gyroscopic force of a spinning flywheel. In 1903, he patented a gyroscopically stabilized monorail system that he developed for military use. His first demonstration model was a box measuring 762 by 300 millimeters, containing the balancing system. However, this was enough for the Army Council to recommend a sum of £10,000 for the development of a full-sized machine. Their finance department vetoed this decision. However, the Army found £2,000 from various sources to fund Brennan's work. On October 15, 1909, the carriage moved under its own power for the first time, carrying 32 people around the factory. The gyro locomotive measured 12.2 by 3 meters and was equipped with a 20-horsepower gasoline engine, which allowed it to reach a speed of 35 kilometers per hour. A separate gasoline engine powered a generator, which supplied electricity to the gyro motors and the compressor. For the first time, the full-size locomotive was successfully demonstrated to the public. November 10, 1909, in Gillingham, England, at the 1910 exhibition in White City, London. Brennan built a 1-mile-long monorail track and carried about 40 people at once on his 22-ton prototype with the Winston Gyro Stabilization system. Churchill, who was the Home Secretary at the time, was one of the passengers. He was so impressed that he brought the Prime Minister, other cabinet members, and his family to see this marvel the following week. The exhibit received the grand prize of the exhibition. Although the vehicle's ability to balance on a single rail was impressive, especially when stationary, it was not commercially successful, partly because of concerns that the gyroscopes could fail, and partly because each car, whether passenger or freight, had to be equipped with a gyroscope. When did Brennan complete the tests of his vehicle? Ogast, Sherl, or Ogast? Whichever you prefer? A German publisher and philanthropist announced a public demonstration of the gyroscopic monorail that he had developed in Germany. The demonstration was scheduled to take place on November 10, 1909, at the Berlin Zoological Garden. Sherl's machine was somewhat smaller than Brennan's and was just over 5 meters long. It could accommodate 4 people. The gyroscopes were located under the seats and had vertical axes. The servo mechanism was hydraulic, and the propulsion system was electric. Strictly speaking, Ogast Sherl simply provided financial support. The gyroscopic mechanism was developed by Paul Froelich and the car by Emil Falk. The concept of a railless gyrocar was first described by Kenneth Brown in the book Two Boys on a Gyrocar. The first gyrocar brought to life in metal was the invention of Pyotr Petrovich Shilovsky. It is worth noting that Shilovsky also started with gyro locomotives at the same time as Brennan and Sherl. Moreover, all three knew each other, corresponded, and you could say worked together to some extent. Pyotr Petrovich came from a wealthy noble family, held a high position in society, and was able to afford inventing at his own expense. His father, an actual state councilor, sent his son to the Imperial School of Jurisprudence, where Shilovsky began his service. He was a judicial investigator, deputy prosecutor, justice of the peace, vice governor, and then reached the peak of his career, governorship in VV. Kostroma in 1910-1912 and Olonets in 1912-1913 in the provinces. The problem was, and Olonets in 1912-1913 in the provinces. The problem was that Pyotr Petrovich was not ambitious enough. Everything came easily to him because of his talent, but he wanted to work with technology, not with paperwork. Therefore, in July 1913, he voluntarily left government service for good and fully immersed himself in inventing. By that time, he was already a well-known engineer abroad, corresponded with Brennan and other technical minds of Europe, and had several patents of his own. In 1909, Pyotr Petrovich simultaneously filed patent applications in Russia, Great Britain, France, Germany, and the United States for a gyroscopic balancing system for railway transport. He received all the patents except the Russian one, either that same year or the following year, and only the domestic officials reviewed his application for almost 5 years. To get any kind of funding, a working prototype was needed, which Shilovsky demonstrated in 1911 at the St. Petersburg Railway Exhibition, dedicated to the 75th anniversary of Russian railways. The model received a certificate of praise and remained just a model. None of the departments showed any interest in this invention. Then Shilovsky went to London, where he demonstrated the idea to the managers of the large automobile factory, Walsley Tool and Motor Car Company. The design was fundamentally different from Brennan's. Shilovsky intended to build a gyrocar that did not require rails. The task seemed much more difficult because, firstly, the car is significantly smaller in size, and it's not easy to fit a bulky gyroscopic mechanism into it. And secondly, without a guide rail, the driver could turn too sharply even for a gyrocar and tip it over. This problem had to be solved. November 13, 1913, the first gyroscopic car in history drove through the inner grounds of the Wolseley factory. The car weighed a hefty 2,750 kilograms with a 1-meter diameter flywheel alone contributing 600 kilograms to the total weight. It was equipped with 2 engines, a conventional internal combustion engine and a generator driven by it, which powered an electric motor that spun the gyroscope. It's hard to comprehend how Shilovsky, an incredibly talented man, but still without any formal engineering education, managed to put all this together in a relatively small Gyrocar. April 28, 1914, after a series of tests and one fall caused by a driver's mistake, Shilovsky himself drove the Gyrocar through the streets of London. There were also spectacular public relations shows, as we would call them today, during which city residents tried to tip the car over, but couldn't even rock it. It became a sensation. All the newspapers wrote about the Russian inventor and his car. Brennan came to see the Gyrocar and congratulated his colleague on his success. However, in the summer of 1914, the First World War began. This put an end to the developments and, in general, made it very difficult for Shilovsky to travel between St. Petersburg and London. The paths of the Count and his amazing machine diverged. Pyotr Petrovich had worked a lot on gun stabilization systems, even before the war, and now he had a good reason to offer the Army a whole series of interesting projects of a similar nature. Among them was a gyroscopically balanced naval gun, unaffected by rolling, as well as an orthoscope gyroscopic course indicator. The latter was tested on the steam yacht Strela and on Sikorsky's airplanes, Ilya Muromets, but it was never put into production. And the Gyrocar, the Wolseley company, literally buried it in the ground, just like a number of other experimental and valuable models that could have fallen into German hands if the war had ended unfavorably. Later, they planned to dig the car up, but something went wrong. After the war, Shilovsky remained in Soviet Russia, facing all the resulting consequences. But he was lucky. Lenin really loved all sorts of technical innovations and amazing inventions. On September 8, 1919, Peter Shilovsky gave a successful report at the next VSNKH Congress about the construction of a gyroscopic railway line from the Kremlin to Kuntsevo. In it, he brought up his idea from 1911, hoping to spark the interest of the new authorities. He was correct. The railway was acknowledged as a vital and crucial undertaking. In the early 1920s, construction began on an experimental 40-kilometer monorail from Petrograd to Gachina. Preparatory work also began on creating a train consisting of a steam locomotive and 2 carriages, with a total capacity of 400 people. But by 1922, the party's course began to change little by little. Vladimir Lenin, in declining health, was gradually withdrawing from affairs. Funding was withdrawn when only 12 kilometers of track had been built, and Shilovsky, realizing that he had no prospects here and was more likely to face trouble, left for England again, together with his family. He had a decent engineering career in the British branch of the famous company, which was known for serious developments in the field of gyroscopes and, by the way, for introducing autopilots in aviation. In 1938, Shilovsky finally managed to have his rusted Gyrocar dug out of the ground. The car was restored, painted, and placed in the Wolseley Museum. Amazingly, 10 years later, while the Count was still alive, during a museum inventory, the exhibit was deemed worthless and was cut up for scrap metal. Later, technology historians tore their hair out, but it was too late. Shilovsky himself died in peace and quiet in 1957 at the age of 85. In 1921, the Gisberger Company from France developed a prototype of a gyroscopic car, which a year later was shown at the Paris Motor Show as a bare chassis. It is known that the 2-wheeled vehicle was equipped with a 4-cylinder engine and a 3-speed gearbox. However, the prototype never went into mass production and faded into oblivion. In 1927, Louis Brennan, who was highly respected at the time and working on gyroscopic systems for aviation, built a gyroscopic car with 12,000 pounds provided by John Courtauld. Under the front seats were 2 gyroscopes, spinning in opposite directions in a horizontal plane at a speed of 3,500 revolutions per minute, powered by electric motors. To create sufficient holding force, each flywheel weighed 91 kilograms. The car had an engine. 2 side wheels were lowered manually when stopping, and if the driver forgot to deploy them, The Gyrocar would balance for a few minutes thanks to the inertia of the flywheels, and then automatically deploy the landing gear. Brennan demonstrated the car to companies, but this venture was not successful. Did not have any. In 1932, he died at the age of 79 after being hit by a car during a visit to Switzerland, and his Gyrocars were later dismantled. And in this episode of the video, we will talk about the inventor Charles Taylor from Colorado, United States of America, and his prototypes of single-wheeled Gyrocars. One of the first models was developed in the mid-1950s. The machine was built around a large wheel, apparently a tractor wheel, and maintained its balance using a gyroscope. Judging by the home video where Taylor tested a later prototype built in the early 1960s, the stability was actually quite good both in a straight line and in turns. Taylor built a number of working prototypes and received a patent in 1964 and also demonstrated at least one of his vehicles to the Pentagon. He hoped that his vehicle could be used as an all-terrain vehicle. It's hard to imagine in which industry such a vehicle could be used, but from an engineering design perspective, Charles's single-wheel Gyrocars are a fascinating thing. By the way, Taylor, who died in 1997, has followers these days. This footage is proof of that. Ford Gyron was first shown to the public in 1961 at the Detroit Auto Show as a concept car. The earliest sketches of the Gyron were made in 1956 by Alex Tremulous, a well-known Greek-American industrial designer. He believed that his design for a two-wheeled gyroscopically stabilized car would represent the ultimate achievement in automotive aerodynamics. In short, Tremulous expected that the Gyron would be a real breakthrough that would influence all future car designs. Tremulous renewed his interest in the Gyron after learning about the 1959 concept, which was proclaimed the most advanced and most exotic car in the world. Tremulous felt that he could achieve more. Around the same time, the company management assigned a new employee, Sid Mead, to work with Tremulous on the Gyron, and together they convinced them to let them build a full-scale version of the car. The development of a gyroscopic system capable of keeping the Gyrocar upright was considered too expensive an undertaking for a show car, and a pair of wheels on outrigger supports was added to the design to keep the Gyron upright on the exhibition stand. However, the front wheel was steerable, and the installed electric motor accelerated the show car with its fiberglass body to about 8 kilometers per hour. Gyron debuted in 1961 and became one of Tremulous's last projects at Ford. However, he continued to develop the idea of a two-wheel Gyrocars for a long time after he left the company. The concept from 1962 was destroyed due to a fire. Only a small model of the Gyron has survived to this day, which was sold at auction in 2012 for $40,000. Louis Sweeney received a United States patent for an automatic stabilization system for unstable vehicles in March 1964. Together with his partners, his brother Ernest Sweeney and his friend Harry Ferreira, Louis designed and built a small gyro monorail in his backyard in 1962 to test the concept. It operated successfully for several years and was demonstrated to the press multiple times. The team also developed a two-wheeled vehicle based on the same gyroscopic stabilization technology. In the mid-1960s, Thomas Summers developed and patented a whole family of lightweight and compact cargo gyro trucks, which he intended to use on narrow city streets, forest, and mountain trails. At his company, Summers Gyro, he built two prototypes with load capacities of 360 kilograms and 2.5 tons, but no one paid much attention to them. And now we've come to the working full-size prototype, the Gyro-X, which brings together Alex Tremolis, Thomas Summers, and Louis Sweeney. It was thanks to the efforts of these three that, in 1967, another relatively successful attempt to build a two-wheeled vehicle with gyroscopic stabilization was made at the company's facilities. The idea was as simple as pie. The two-wheeled single-seater vehicle was powered by a 1,275cc engine with 80 horsepower and was stabilized by a gyroscope located in front of the driver, with an operating speed of 4,000 to 6,000 revolutions per minute. Thanks to such a high rotation speed, the flywheel weighed only 12 kilograms. Thanks to excellent aerodynamics, the maximum speed of the vehicle was 200 kilometers per hour, and at a cruising speed of 90, the fuel consumption was supposed to be just under 3 liters per 100 kilometers. I agree, today you can achieve this with a four-wheeled hybrid car, but this was the 60s. At that time in the United States, a fuel consumption of 25 to 30 liters per 100 kilometers for a passenger car was the norm. It was assembled from winged metal and generally showed the calculated characteristics and had sufficient design features to prevent falling. A pair of raised side wheels protected against falling at speed, for example in turns, and a decrease in the gyroscope's rotation speed led to the automatic deployment of the landing gear, 2 small support wheels on the sides of the rear wheel. Interestingly, to compensate for the longitudinal forces from the gyroscope, the designers made the machine long enough, placing the gyroscope at its geometric center. Not perfect, of course, but as an option, it was created with a long-term perspective in mind. This sports car, designed for success, was supposed to become the progenitor of an entire range of Gyrocars, from family two-wheeled pickups to, who knows, khaki-colored amphibious monsters with a menacing inscription on the side. Regrettably, the rotor, specifically the challenge of spinning it up, turned out to be the primary disadvantage. Even under the best conditions, it took the driver at least 3 minutes to spin it up to operating speed. History is silent about its further fate. But apparently, the machine never went beyond demonstration models. Maybe gasoline was too cheap back then, or maybe Americans just couldn't give up their love for 6-meter dreadnoughts from Detroit. Or maybe the marketers lost the advertising war to their competitors. And here is a vehicle created by the company in 1993. The video shows how it maneuvers in the parking lot. The rear part of the Gyroscope was somewhat like a motorcycle, but the rest was under a shell. During development, the company drew inspiration from the works of Alex Tremolis. Then, somewhere in the 90s, the Gyroscope faded into obscurity. Consider the gyro motorcycle as an example. The prospect of preventing a two-wheeled vehicle from tipping over sounds like a simple solution to improve motorcycle safety. However, in the case that appeared in 2017, the gyro motorcycle turned out to be impractical and somewhat ridiculous. And judging by the fact that the last video with this device is already 5 years old, it looks like the project has stalled. However, the corporation's engineers recently proposed their own version of the gyro motorcycle STO, picking up on the idea. Daniel Kim came to the conclusion that natural selection was unfair to gyroscopic vehicles, and that the shortcomings of Gyrocars don't prevent making another attempt. Accordingly, the most important factor in developing the model was to make maximum use of the advantages of the gyroscope. First of all, 2 wheels in a line allow the Gyrocar to be as narrow as you want, like a motorcycle. Of all Kim's predecessors, only Alex Tremolis took advantage of this when creating. Kim went even further and designed a vehicle that, except for the gyroscope, was no different from a motorcycle. It's narrow, so it can easily get through traffic jams by riding between the lanes. At the same time, it has a big advantage over a motorcycle in terms of stability, and as a result, can take turns at much higher speeds, almost without tilting the body. By the way, Kim paid special attention to how it handles turns. To avoid the mistakes of his predecessors, he gave the flywheels an extra degree of freedom by placing them on a movable suspension frame controlled by the electronics of the flywheels. Psi 12? They're small with high rotation speed. Hello to Tom Summers. However, Lit Motors is keeping the exact figures secret for now. It is powered by 2 hub motors with a total output of 40 kilowatts. Its flywheels still serve the purpose of storing energy, and any excess is fed into the vehicle's onboard network. The Odin is designed exclusively as a city car, or rather, even as a motorcycle. Behind the driver's seat, there's an additional, rather narrow space where you can put some luggage or seat a companion. However, the sketch presented by the developers suggests that the passenger won't be too comfortable, even though the motorcycles are positioned as 2-seaters. According to calculations, a single charge of the lithium batteries should be enough for about 300 kilometers of travel, which is more than sufficient for city conditions. Charging takes from 4 to 6 hours. The maximum stated speed of the concept car is 190 kilometers per hour, and it accelerates from 0 to 100 in 6 seconds. The driver's safety is ensured not only by its rollover resistance, but also by mandatory seat belts and an airbag system. As for electronic features, the creators claim it can be started with a smartphone, and it also has other automotive conveniences like multimedia, a navigation system, and an onboard computer. Overall, you want to believe in this development. Perhaps this is the most convenient-looking urban moto concept among all those that have appeared in recent years, and also the most stable and safe. The creators claim that once mass production begins, it will cost no more than $16,000. But we know that preliminary statements often differ from reality. Regardless of perspective, it's been over 7 years since those statements were made. And finally, I just can't ignore the channel whose author literally started working on the Gyrocar project just in the past month. The idea is very interesting, and I'm closely following it. As you can see, after tracing more than a century of attempts to create gyrocars, it turns out that none of them have proven themselves commercially or gone into mass production so far. Attempts to create such vehicles are ongoing, and only time will tell what happens next. However, we shouldn't forget that gyroscopically stabilized vehicles are quite widespread nowadays. That's the same Segway or countless numbers of monowheels. All of them use technology that was developed and perfected by people like Shilovsky, Brennan, Tremails, Summers, and many others. Also, without gyroscopes, it's impossible to imagine modern shipbuilding or aviation. Even in the smartphone that's either in your hands or somewhere nearby, there's a gyroscope installed. With that, my friends, a few words about Gyrocars come to an end. I hope you enjoyed the material. If so, please support it. As usual, like, repost, and subscribe. This was the Cross Moto channel with you.